Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Pollinator Week celebration brought to you by kNOweeds, Montana's Noxious Weed Education Campaign. I'm so glad you're here to highlight these incredible creatures that keep our ecosystems and our food systems thriving. Today, we'll be talking about why pollinators matter, how we can support them, and why not all plants are created equal when it comes to feeding them. We're starting our conversation with Montana State University horticulture agent serving Yellowstone County, Anthony Sammartano. He has been working closely with pollinators and community education. After that, we'll bring in Sydney Crabtree, an apiary and natural resource specialist for the Montana Department of Agriculture, to talk about why weeds don't work for all pollinators. I would like to welcome Anthony Sammartano, Montana State University's Extension Horticulture Agent who serves Yellowstone County. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for all that you do to support pollinators.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Awesome. To begin, I'd like to ask you about why pollinators are so important, not just for nature, but people, agriculture, and our everyday lives.
They are important because they help provide a lot of needed services for our agriculture and food systems. Without pollinators, we would likely lose over 70% of our food crops. Without those pollinators out there in the fields in action, we would have far less food for us to consume. And then they also help keep the wonderful plants alive that provide clean water and clean air for us to breathe and use.
Awesome. Thank you so much. They do sound very important. For our next question, you spent a lot of time working with pollinators. What first sparked your interest in it?
Just the sheer diversity and differences between them all. There's a whole world of nighttime pollinators out there that are super cool and unique, and I found it fascinating and just dove right in.
Awesome. That's great. Do you have a favorite pollinator species, or perhaps there's one that tends to be overlooked and deserves some more attention?
Favorite species is hard. I think my favorites is kind of a little more broad and general there, but just the moths. They serve as great pollinators. They're out there at night. They are super colorful and diverse as far as their shape and their textures and patterns. Um, and they're just very unique. There's so many different kinds, and they can get huge too. Big old moths out there.
I like it when they get a little bit fuzzy.
Yes, well, and then they can sometimes be super docile too and crawl around on you and leave some of the fuzz on you. They're fun pollinators.
Cool. Um, Pollinator Week is celebrated across the country. Why do you think it's important that we take its time to celebrate these pollinators?
It's important because I think oftentimes they can be rather overlooked as far as the services that they provide. Not only are they a great food source or help provide for our food, but they also help protect it. Some of the pollinators are what you wouldn't think are pollinators, like wasps or yellow jackets or some of those sort of critters, actually help hunt down garden pests as well as pollinating your fruits and veggies. So I think for some creatures doing some very serious good work for us, I think it's nice to spend a day or a week appreciating them.
That is so cool. And it's just, yeah, we don't always think about it. So it's nice to just one time a year, one week, go out and celebrate. What do you plan to do this Pollinator Week?
This pollinator week, I think I will go out and look at the flowers and enjoy who's visiting them, as well as maybe stopping by the city park in Billings, Pioneer Park. There's a pollinator festival happening in June, and I'm going to go spend some time there and talk about pollinators and celebrate them with friends.
Awesome. Here's a little bit of information on that pollinator fair. I know that week we're going to be going out and doing some seed planting and finding some natives that I would like to put in some areas of my garden. So I think it's just a good time to get out and maybe pull some weeds and put some natives in, give them some more food.
Mhm.
Are there any resources that you would like to share with the public?
If you're curious about pollinators or plants that attract them or anything in between, please contact your local county extension office or your local NRCS office. Um, or just any cool, good garden group that's out there. Anyone who's growing flowers or things has probably seen some cool pollinators that you could learn about. But it's important to note too, to know your bugs and such when you're in your backyard because you never know who might be a pollinator. There's some insects and creatures out there you wouldn't suspect would be helping you, but they are. So it's good to know who it is before you try to get rid of it or figure out a way to get out of it. So yeah.
Yeah, that biodiversity is really important starting from the ground up, taking a closer look and seeing what actually is there because oftentimes there seems to be a lot more.
It's not just the bees and the butterflies. There are beetles that do it. As I said before, moths and actual flies. So there's a great birth of pollinators we don't even think about sometimes.
Well, thank you for your time today, Anthony. Your insights really help us understand how connected we are to these tiny but mighty creatures. We appreciate you being here with us today, and I hope you have a wonderful pollinator week.
Thank you for having me.
Now that we've explored the big picture, why pollinators matter, we're going to shift to something that affects pollinators every single day, the plants they rely on. A common belief is a flower is a flower, and if something blooms, it must be food for pollinators. But the reality is, it's much more complex. To help us understand why weeds complicate the relationship between pollinators and their ecosystems, joining us today, we have Sydney Crabtree, apiary and natural resource specialist from the Montana Department of Agriculture. She will be presenting on how invasive plants potentially disturb the evolutionary relationship between native pollinators and plants.
So hi, everybody. My name is Sydney, and I work with the Montana Department of Agriculture as the apicultural and natural resources specialist. I was hired on by AgCorps about a year and a half ago, um, and my passion for pollinators brought me all the way from Georgia up to Montana so that I can help everybody believe in the power of the pollinator. Um, So today I have the privilege of talking to you all about something that is very near and dear into my heart, and that is the Plant Pollinator Interaction Network. Specifically, we're going to be learning more specifics about how the things that grow in our backyard, whether they be native or invasive, have a very profound effect on the way that pollinators utilize the resources. So today's roadmap, just for everybody to cue in on, we're going to go through a couple of specialized terms so that we're all on the same page with each other during this conversation. And then I'm going to teach you guys about the bee basics. So that's going to be all the needs of bees and their roles within our ecosystem. Then we're going to move into plant adaptations and evolution. And afterwards, we have a small activity that you guys can do at home. Okay, so before we start, I need us all to be on the same page. As biologists, we have specialized vernacular that helps us communicate without any boundaries, regardless of where we come from. And in order to make sure that we can all communicate on the same level, I'm going to teach you a few new words today. So we're going to learn 7 new vocabulary terms. And they should be easy because they all kind of contrast each other. So looking over here to our terms board, we have 4 general concepts. We have the concept of a self-compatible and a self-incompatible plant. A self-compatible plant is a plant that doesn't require any need for pollinators to reproduce, whereas a self-incompatible plant does require pollinators to reproduce out in the wild. Then over here we have our native versus non-native species. So a native organism is as simple as it sounds. It's an organism that occurs natively within a range, whereas a non-native species, it's harder to define. Generally, we like to leave it open and say that it's just a species introduced to an environment outside of its natural range, either accidentally or purposefully. But a non-native species is different than an invasive species, which is our next concept. An invasive species is just a non-native species that has come into a range and is doing harm to some part of that community. And for our final concept, we have generalized versus specialized species. So a generalist species is something that can use a variety of resources in order to meet its needs, whereas a specialist is something that needs a specific set of things to get the needs that they have to live, and they can't switch it out with anything else. Okay, so now that we've learned a couple of helpful terms, let's move on to the bee basics. So, pollinators. Bees specifically, which is the group that I work with, is very broad, eh, but they are all so diverse and so unique in the way that they interact with their environment, kind of just like us. The big thing that unifies us and bees is that we all have the same intrinsic needs for water, food, shelter, and in broader terms, hygienic practices. So when we think about this in terms of bees and the way they use their environments, we often think about food diversity. So food is not always made the same. Um, when a bee is out foraging, it's often looking for carbs in the form of nectar, proteins in the form of pollen, lipids that also come from pollen. But there are certain aspects of each plant that might provide different levels of nutrition. Of all of these, the most important macronutrients that a bee has to account for is pollen. Pollen is the primary source of lipids and proteins within their diet, and it has been shown through countless studies that high quality and availability of pollen has been shown to increase immune health, overwintering success, pathogenic response and recovery, and reproduction. But getting pollen isn't as simple as going to a grocery store and picking up an apple. There's a lot of in between steps that come with foraging for bees. They need to work as efficiently as possible to meet their quotas before the winter time. Otherwise, they won't be able to make it to the next season. So, when they're trying to forage, they often try to go for things that are both abundant and of high quality to get the most bang for their buck. When these needs aren't met by local flora in the surrounding area, the bee often has to start making really tough decisions. Like, do they go for high availability and low quality food that's close to the hive? Or do they do just the opposite and travel out further to get things that are better for them, that will keep them sustained for longer? But how much energy does that take? And how long do they actually have to live to do that? I like to think about this concept with a grocery store and a fast food chain. They both come with trade-offs and benefits. So if I was working late one night, say till 6 o'clock, and I needed to go and eat in a hurry and get to bed and rest and make sure I was clean for the next day, sometimes I might want to opt for a fast food chain because that's going to require less effort on my part, less energy because I don't have to go home and cook. But on the downside, it's less nutritious for me overall, and sometimes more costly. But on days that I have the time, or if I planned out ahead, specifically me as a person, I would go to the grocery store and I would plan out a meal that is not only nutritious, but it keeps me sustained for longer. It's something that I know will take some time, but in the long run will be better for me. The downsides of doing this is I have to make a lot of effort to make those plans, right? I don't come up with spaghetti dinner recipes all by myself. So it's going to take effort on my part, and that effort is more energy that I could have used to do things that's not required of me to live, like playing video games. Now, the same is for bees, and bees have been on this earth for a really long time, and they've shared an environment with plants for roughly 90 to 150 million years. And while bees have all sorts of strategies in order to interact in their environment, So do plants. Before we get into this topic, let's explore what it is to be a plant, all of the different dynamics and structures of a plant. So now in this diagram, I have just a very simple version of a plant to show you what's going on the top level of the petal. So if I was a bee, I wouldn't really be looking at things like the stigma or the style or the ovary. The most important thing to me is the anther. The anther is this long filamentous tube that holds all of the male parts of the flower. That's where all the pollen that they are required to collect every year to sustain themselves is located. So their biggest job is to find that anther, get the food from the anther, take it back to the hive or nest, wherever you like to call it, and use it in a way that benefits not only them, but usually their whole entire hive. But the thing about flowers is they're not often as simple as this one looks. So the anthers are really clear here because this is a diagram, but a lot of plants have adapted strategies to keep their anthers nice and hidden so that things like robbers that come in and take pollen without pollinating don't take their pollen, or wind and rain doesn't get to it so that they don't lose that precious DNA that they've been working up to build this entire time, you know? So oftentimes they'll have these specialized structures like porous anthers, or they'll have their anthers hidden in a very long tube, or really deep into their petal structure. That deep part is called the corolla. It's super cool. But it's not always as simple as just kind of looking at a flower and seeing where it is. So, how do the bees get past that? Well, like I said, bees and plants have been around each other for a really long time. So, while the plants have been developing, bees have been developing alongside them in order to make sure they all have access to each other. So, some plants, like our long-tongued bee from the tribe Etherbonini, or if you want a better term, just a digger bee, have developed really long and hairy tongues that they can use to get deep into tube-like flowers and harder to get to anthers so that they have more specialized access to those particular flowers. Others have opted for more general strategies, like really strong mandibles so that they can cut holes into the base of flowers and get to the anther no matter how long, short, or hidden it is. It's the most amazing thing to me about pollinators, especially because some of them have such a specialized relationship, kind of like this long-tongued bee, that they have made this intrinsic connection with certain species of plants that literally at this point in their life would not be able to survive without each other. A great example of this that you can apply to our local environment here in Montana is the yucca and the soapwood uh, yucca. So yucca moths and their obligate partner plant have been around each other for centuries. And the way that this works is that the yucca has a really deeply seated tube that only small and very stringy-like mouth parts can access. And not a lot of pollinators possess that particular mouth part, but the yucca moth does. And so for thousands of years, they've been working alongside each other, developing this relationship and fixing themselves in a way that they both have access to one another. And a great trade-off that they've made for this service that the moth provides for it is that the plant will also provide a safe space for the yucca moth to lay its babies and overwinter. It's the coolest thing in the whole wide world. So now that we have a general understanding of pollinators, plants, and what they do respective to one another, how do we think that invasive species are going to disrupt this relationship? They're super competitive, they're super aggressive. Some of them come in without any type of predator or parasite to regulate them. So What do we think is going to happen? So it's really hard to make a generalized statement about the relationship that invasive plants have on pollinator interactions, because the impacts are very inconsistent across species. However, it's largely considered a bad thing when invasive species are introduced to a new area. Like I said, they're competitive. They take up space really fast. They have very few natural predators and parasites that reduce their rate of production. And this really limits the native plant's development because while they're growing out, the space for the native plant is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Thistles are a really great example of how this happens in our own environment. So here we have our musk thistle, and musk thistles are highly invasive noxious weeds that I think are priority 2B on the list here in Montana. Um, and they regularly outcompete our meadow thistles. Musk thistles, as you can see, are really sharp and spiny. They're also tall. They have this beautiful purple plumage that makes them really attractive to bees who can only see in a certain range of light. Whereas musk thistles, they range from light purple to white. They're kind of short to the ground, really fuzzy, not always easy to access. So musk thistles regularly outcompete meadow thistles because they are just out there and they grow fast and they have these rhizotomous root systems that let them take over an area and outcompete everything in its path. So, on the topic of Montana, what does this actually mean for Montana? What does all of this competition lead to? Well, so a part of my job as the apiary and natural resources specialist is helping a variety of people across Montana who are doing pollinator relationship work and bee work. One of my favorite groups to work with this year has been the Bumblebee Atlas team, hosted by the Xerxes Society. And this is the results that they've got for the 2025 Citizen Science Survey on bumblebees in Montana. And this just shows here in this orange graph the number of visits per bee as it relates to the plant genus. And a couple of these names might not be super recognizable to you because they're as a genus. But if you look over here to this host plant status name sheet, it's actually from last year, so don't look at the top 10 host plants name and be confused. But you can see that Centuriae and Hyperculum and Cirsium all have a mixture of non-native and native plants within the state. Whereas all of these native plants over here don't seem to be getting as many visits. And that's really frustrating to me as an individual, just because it means that the work that we're doing out in the field sometimes isn't making a dent to what bees can actually access in their own environments. But again, this top 10 host plants thing was from last year. This orange one is more accurate to what happened in this 2025 survey area. And as you can see, Hyperculum is no longer one of the top 5 plants that bees are constantly visiting, which makes me a very happy camper because that means that our noxious weed efforts for mapping and monitoring and early detection have been going super well, and there might be more Symphocarpos and lupins for the bees to access. So, all in all, the big takeaway that you should have from this meeting we just had together is that even though the relationship between native and invasive plants, when it comes to pollinators, is super sticky, when they come into our native environments, they'll displace all of our native plants and along with it, our specialized pollinators. And it's always something to be mindful of because even though we can look out and we can see a musk thistle being pollinated by a bee, that doesn't mean that all of the bees in the environment are getting the exact same thing available to them. Okay. Before I go, I just wanted to let everybody know that being conscious about pollinators sometimes isn't enough. We also have to be conscious about everything else that's going on in their environment, and that includes noxious weeds. So I always recommend to you all, whether you're engaging in the outdoors as a citizen scientist or as a hiker or as somebody who just loves to go sit out in nature, to make yourself aware of the noxious weeds in your area so that when you see them, you can report them and we can minimize their spread and their effect on our local pollinators. And if you'd like to learn more about that, please be sure to follow this scannable link or go to agmt.gov/noxious weeds. And that's it.
Thank you, Sydney. That was awesome. Great understanding that, yes, even though they're blooming, they're not always the best choice. Need something for everybody, and that biodiversity, lots of things living in an area is what we're all striving for. And a great way to reach that is by planting some native species. Can you tell us one of your favorite native species or one that you think is overlooked?
Sorry, did it again. So I'm currently working on a native species guide for the bumblebees of Montana, along with my friend Casey Delphilia and a couple of members of the Xerxes Society. And one species that I would really love to see that I think doesn't get enough love is the species Bombus bohemicus, and that's just the gypsy bumblebee. Now, he is a cuckoo bumblebee. So, what he does is he actually takes over a nest of a variety of bumblebees in order to make sure that he survives. But those kind of parasites are super important for the downward regulation of bad genes within that ecosystem. And I think they're the coolest things ever.
That's awesome. What are you going to be up to for Pollinator Week, National Pollinator Week? It's important to get out and celebrate and share, try to encourage others. How are you going to be celebrating?
That's a great question, and I'm actually going to click over to another slide. So, like I said, I love working with the Bumblebee Atlas project, and this year we've adopted 4 grid cells to do surveys in. So my entire next month is going to be about planning and executing as many bumblebee surveys as I can across the state. And I hope that you guys would like to join and be interested in learning a little bit more about these beautiful creatures that are very specific to Montana. Um, and also, just getting out in nature. It's always good to just get yourself out of the office from time to time. And I very desperately need that time right now.
Is there any last words of wisdom to share with us, Sydney, to help us celebrate Pollinator Week or help us, give pollinators that upper hand, things that we can do?
Uh, Report noxious weeds, always. Keep yourself informed. If you see something, say something, because even if it's not what you think it is, it's better to have a misidentified plant than a plant that wasn't identified at all.
Anthony, how about you? After we've had this amazing presentation from Sydney, is there any last words of advice you have for anybody on today about how to increase pollinators, how to get them the
Plant a
food that they
variety of
need?
flowers. So the more variety of flowers you can plant, the better. And know your insects and who's a pollinator. If you have questions about bugs in your backyard, reach out to someone in the know. Sounds like Sydney is a great person to contact, as well as any local county extension office. If they don't know it, they know who to ask. We can help you figure out who's living and sharing your space.
Awesome. Well, I thank you guys again for coming on today and speaking. Um, Pollinator Week is a reminder that small actions like planting native flowers, reducing pesticide use, or simply learning more can make a real difference. The invasive species education personnel in me likes to remind people to go out and enjoy the great outdoors, but don't be the one letting invasive species catch a ride. I personally like to practice play, clean, go. When I get out of the vehicle before I hit the trailhead, I'm not carrying any mud and weed seeds with me. Same thing when I'm out recreating. When I get back from the trail, I don't want to take those invasive species home. So there I am using my boot brush, brushing off, making sure that I've got no mud and weed seeds on me. So we hope you guys have a wonderful day. Thank you for everybody who is online listening to us. We hope we've inspired you, and we've provided some support. And have a great day. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having us.